So let's begin with Rossini now. Um, from what I know, I think he studied a little bit with Mate, but then he needed to go and conquer the world to make some money, and he was astoundingly successful. So tell me a little bit from your research, what you figured from Rossini's operas.
Um, well, there is a strong classical strain in Rossini um, that, for example, with very few exceptions, uh, he would write these very large numbers, as they're called, whether it's an aria or an ensemble, in multiple movements. Um, and uh, with very few exceptions, he will begin and end these sometimes very long numbers in the same key. And that's a kind of classicism. Um, his later Italian composers break away from that, and unity of key becomes much less central as a sort of aesthetic requirement. Um, quite famously, Rossini wrote out a lot of his vocal ornamentation, though he still expected singers to supply their own. Um, Obviously, toward the end of his career, he's in Paris. He writes William Tell, Guillaume Tell. I have an entire chapter on Guillaume Tell. Um, um, but I do contrast this sort of neoclassical side of Rossini with the more full-bloodedly romantic composers who follow him, like Bellini and Donizetti.
How much of Rossini is Haydn and Mozart? Because I think there are anecdotes where he says he was really influenced by these two Germanic composers.
Well, toward the end of his life, and I think this is mostly in his famous interview with Wagner, which is really toward the end of his life. So many decades after he'd stopped composing, he speaks about his worship of Mozart. Um, I'm not an expert on the history of very early Rossini, but to the best of my knowledge, he knew the instrumental music of Mozart. Again, things like the quartets, the quintets, perhaps the symphonies. He had studied those in Bologna as a teenager. Um, Mozart's operas were not really performed in the north of Italy, except for a very short window right after the Austrians resumed control after the Napoleonic Wars. So there's what one Italian musicologist calls a Mozart boom in 1816. Don Giovanni was done in 1814, but the 1816 season was the height of it. Now, by 1816, Rossini is already a fairly mature composer, and he isn't even in the north anymore. He's living in Naples. So I think it is, as far as Haydn, we do know that the young Rossini conducted a performance of Haydn's oratorio, The Seasons. And Bonifacio Ascioli, who was the head of the Milan Conservatory until the Austrians kicked him out when they took over again in 1814. Ascioli was a great lover of Haydn's oratorios and Mozart in general. He was influential in bringing Haydn and Mozart to Italy. He corresponded with Haydn. He actually was the teacher of Mozart's son. Haydn recommended that Mozart's son study with him. But as far as Rossini himself, I think that Cimarosa and Paisiello are more important than Haydn and Mozart. Cimarosa and Paisiello were considered sort of the gods of late 18th century Italian opera. They were perhaps worshipped more than they were performed after the end of the Napoleonic period. But I've looked at a little bit of Ascioli's music. It's very similar to Paisiello. Osceoli's theoretical writings, particularly his writings on rhythm, they really seem to be describing Paisiello's music more than anybody else's.
Okay, so this is confusing because we were separating Germans, Italians, but I mean, I feel like maybe we should mention Haydn and Mozart themselves. Isn't there a strong Italian sort of core to their music that really, if we call them Germans, yes, they are by ethnicity or nationality, but I mean, Haydn worked with Porpora as an accompanist and studied composition with him. Mozart extensively toured Italy and worked with many Italians. So is it all just Italian, or is there something German that we can identify there?
Well, let me pick this apart a bit. Mozart spent some very important early time in Italy, studying with Padre Martini, writing operas for Italy. He spoke Italian well. He was strongly influenced by Johann Christian Bach, who was himself strongly Italianate. So there's a very strong Italian connection with Mozart. Now, the Italians didn't consider Mozart Italian, not by a long shot. He was German. The Italian connection is actually weaker with Haydn. He did have that very important early experience with Porpora, as you mentioned, which was apparently eye-opening. He never went to Italy. I have an article coming out on text setting in Mozart, Haydn, Paisiello, and Cimarosa. And Haydn's Italian text setting is not as idiomatic as Mozart's. So I think he was less steeped in Italian music and sort of, as I say, he said Italian less idiomatically.